It's time to translate the science, data, and research behind dairy cattle genetics into real-world applications for farmers around the globe. Brought to you by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, the CDCB CowCast begins now.
Welcome back, everyone, to the CDCB CowCast. I am once again your host, Katie Schmidt, the Industry Relations Manager for CDCB. And joining us is a long-awaited guest on the CowCast, Dr. Taylor McWhorter. So welcome to the show, Taylor.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. I'm looking forward to our discussions today.
If you are reading the title of this episode, you know we are going to talk about reproductive performance traits that are changing in August. It was just announced. Before we get to that, though, just some quick background on who Taylor is. She's been a part of the CDCB team since February of 2023 when she joined us as a geneticist. She is also a returning CDCB intern, so she spent a summer with the team in Maryland while she was studying at the University of Georgia, where she got her bachelor's and her Ph.D. in quantitative genetics. So Taylor spent some time working on beef bull fertility, in beef on dairy matings, heat tolerance in dairy cattle, and genomic evaluation theory with single step, which, again, we've talked about in the past on this show. We are going to cover in great detail in the coming months as we transition towards some new methodology in the U.S. So we are very grateful to have Taylor on the show today, though, because she is our lead researcher on the review of the female reproductive performance traits at CDCB. So, Taylor, I think in order to get us started, let's kind of get a little lay of the land for listeners who don't live and breathe in this every day like you and I do. So, when we think about reproductive performance traits and how it relates to animal profitability on the dairy, what are some of those traits that producers are using today? What are they measuring? How do we use them?
Thank you, Katie. So, when we talk about genetic evaluations for our reproductive performance in our dairy cattle, we're really trying to capture a few different biological and management pieces. So, each trait looks at reproduction slightly different. It's going to give the producers flexibility and how they approach their selection. So, the first trait that we currently publish is daughter pregnancy rate, or DPR. This is the trait that's helping us look at the big picture, if you will. So it's going to reflect how quickly our cows get pregnant after calving, or the overall reproductive efficiency during lactation. More specifically, it represents the percentage of our open cows that are going to become pregnant in each 21-day cycle. Then we also have cow conception rate, or CCR. This is a trait that focuses on the success per insemination in our lactating cows. So how likely is a cow to conceive each time that we breed her? We also have heifer conception rate, or HCR. This is going to have the same concept of CCR, but it's specific to our maiden heifers. Our fourth trait that's currently published at CDCB is Early First Calving, or EFC. This is looking specifically at the age at first calving. So from her birth, how quickly is she going to enter the milking herd? Now, we are introducing our new trait, first service to conception, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself, Katie. I'm excited to talk about it. So really together, these traits let us look at reproduction from multiple angles, not just one number.
Yeah, we will certainly cover first service to conception because it is a big part of this story and this topic. But Taylor, thank you for kind of pointing out what those traits are we're going to talk about and what we're really focused in on for this episode. And I want you to take us through this research and review process that's been going on for the last 2 years that you and a team have really been diving into. What have you been reviewing? What does that look like? How did it come to be? Kind of hit us with the highlight.
Absolutely. So it's been an excellent team to work with, not just those researchers at CDCB, but we've also collaborated with the USDA Animal Genomics Improvement Laboratory, as well as one of our interns from the University of Connecticut. Now, these traits overall have been around for a while. So DPR was early 2000s. We first published in 2003. CCR and HCR, we've published since 2009. and most recently EFC in 2019. But we know that dairy management has changed drastically over that time. So now we have resources and tools such as synchronization programs, we use sexed beef semen, and really just a lot more variation in how producers are managing their breeding programs. So another example of this is maybe a producer is choosing a herd or cow-specific voluntary waiting period. But what we started to see in the evaluations were signals that these models maybe weren't fully keeping up with these management changes. Things like we'd see unexpected genetic trends and a little instability from evaluation to evaluation. So the goal of this review was really one, to modernize the system, two, to make sure that we were separating genetics and management in our models, and then three, to make sure the evaluations reflect what's actually happening on our farms today.
And we've got a great document and resource for listeners and viewers. If they want to dive into like all of the components of this research project, we'll link the URL in the show notes. That's a nice 4-page summary of the research process, who was involved, and what the 10 big updates are that are happening. And Taylor, let's talk about some of those big updates that are taking place. If we start at DPR, it's a hot topic and one of really the big traits that signaled the need for this review. So in DPR, we are updating how we handle voluntary waiting periods. And let's talk about what we did there and maybe why it happened.
I'll go a little bit into what we've done in the past and what led to this change and what we're doing in this update. So one of the updates specifically to DPR was really led by Dr. Jason Graham. He was one of the researchers that we collaborated with at the USDA Agile. And then Dr. Graham also became a consultant for CDCB for some time, so he did some great work on this topic. Previously, DPR assumed a fixed voluntary waiting period of 50 days with this 20-day grace period. So what do I mean by grace period? Well, it was essentially to buffer or account for the fact that not all cows are bred exactly at the same time after the waiting period. There's some natural variation. But even within that buffer, it still assumed in a broader sense that herds were managing breeding in a similar way and starting at roughly the same time, that 50-day voluntary waiting period. Now, this voluntary waiting period is the amount of time after calving that the producers are intentionally waiting before beginning to breed her again. And that's really a management decision, not biology. So some herds do start breeding at 50 days, but we're recognizing that others are waiting longer depending on their individual goals. So what we have here is a figure showing us why this change matters. So what you're looking at is the average voluntary waiting period over time. So on that x-axis, we have year, and it's separated by lactation groups. First lactation only is what you see in red, and then our second and later lactations are the blue line. And what we see is that our herd average by year voluntary waiting period hasn't been constant. It actually declined for a period and then increased pretty substantially in more recent years, especially in those first lactation animals. So if we're holding that constant in the model, we're not quite capturing what's actually happening in this management decision on farms.
So in the new system, how is this going to get handled?
Absolutely. So in the new system, DPR is now allowing for us to account for a voluntary waiting period that varies by herd year as well as by that lactation group. Now, this might sound like a really small change, but it is a big step in separating the management decisions from genetics in our models. Keep in mind, the interpretation stays the same. It's still expressed as a percentage difference in pregnancy rate relative to the breed base. So for context, we can say a 1 percentage point change in DPR corresponds to about a 4-day difference in days open. So again, what's changed is not how we interpret the numbers, but how accurately the number reflects the genetic reproductive performance rather than management decisions.
I think the phrase that I was taught through this process is that the trait is not revised, it's the model that's revised. And that is really the key part here.
That's correct.
Okay, so Taylor, if we think about the next one, and like I said, there's about 10 updates that are being made, but we've pulled out a couple of the key ones or the big ticket items. So the next one we have is the service sire breed, mating type, and short cycling being accounted for in our CCR and HCR models now. What does it mean to account for that, and how do we define these different factors?
For CCR and HCR, we added a little more detail of what's actually happening during the individual breedings or the individual inseminations. So we know from one insemination to the next, things that can change are something like service sire breed. Again, this is something that has to be reported to us. It's not a mandatory data requirement. So we will include the information of service sire breed. Mating type, was it sexed, conventional? Was it a traditional breeding? And the third factor you mentioned is something we call short cycle. So, short cycling is when a cow is bred again between 10 and 17 days after the previous insemination. So, this can indicate things like biological issues that are underlying or a failed conception.
And are all of these new factors in the model, Taylor, or are some of them things that already existed?
They are not all new. Something that was already accounted for in the existing system was mating type. So, as sex semen has been used heavily in the last few years, those have already been accounted for in the existing models. The new factors are the service sire breed and the short cycle.
Fantastic. So, how does this improve the evaluations of these two traits?
So, by accounting for these new factors, we're removing sources of bias that weren't previously captured in the model, right? These are the environmental or non genetic factors that we want to account for. So, for example, the insemination success or failure can be influenced on whether sex semen or beef semen was used. And those decisions, again, are management driven, not genetic. So, similarly, the short cycling gives us biological information about failed conception that we weren't fully utilizing before. Again, by including these three factors, we're doing a better job isolating the animal's true genetic ability to conceive rather than confounding it with how the herd's being managed.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance you guys have had to find in these traits as they're so heavily management influenced. And one of the questions that I hear, Taylor, when we talk about this with industry folks and producers is the question about how we handle embryo transfer calves, especially when we think about mating type. So, what do we do with embryo transfer animals or recipients or the donor cows? Like, how does that get handled in these evaluations?
It's a great question. And it's something we handle very intentionally in the evaluation. In general, records associated with our embryo transfer, whether that's ET born animals, split embryos, clones, they are not used as standard reproductive performance records. The reason is that the embryo recovery and the transfer process itself can influence reproductive performance. So, including those records could bias the evaluations. And practically, we do handle this in a couple ways. So, first, at the individual animal level, cows or heifers that were born from embryo transfer, split embryos, nuclear transfer, or the embryo pedigree are removed from the reproductive performance data set completely. Now, this applies to CCR, HCR, and FSC. We have a slightly different edit that I'll talk about in a minute for DPR. So, for these three traits, we also check for consistency at the herd year level. And this has to do with consistency of reporting. So, if a herd has a high proportion of ET births, more than about 10%, and the reporting ET related reproductive events doesn't line up with that, then that entire herd year can be excluded. And that's really just to make sure that the data we're receiving is consistent and reliable. For donor dams specifically, we're not trying to evaluate their reproductive performance through these records. The focus is on the reproductive performance of the animal herself. So, donor dam information is mainly used to identify our embryo transfer cases, not to create a separate reproductive performance phenotype. And I mentioned I'd talk about DPR specifically as well. We take a similar approach, but it's implemented slightly different. Our lactation records from the donor dams are identified through ET donor status, and those are removed from the DPR data set. So again, overall, the goal is to avoid mixing the biological reproductive performance with the effects of advanced reproductive technologies, and to keep the evaluation focused on the true genetic differences. And importantly, these edits have been in place for quite a while. This is not new to the updated system that we are implementing in August. So this is really about maintaining the consistency and data quality rather than introducing another new change.
Sure. And I think the other thing that I'm taking away from that, Taylor, is the importance of producers recording embryo transfer in their farm software and in their calving data, right? So to make sure their calving records reflect those embryo transfer calves, we know they're high value calves. It's also incredibly informative for us on the genetic side of things, and also allowing your farm data to be included in the evaluation. Okay, so to the next one we're going to touch on here is a little bit more technical for folks as you're reading through the 10 changes, and that is that EFC, or Early First Calving, is moving to a single trait model. What does that mean, and why does it matter in these updates?
So EFC is a little bit different from the other reproductive traits. While DPR, CCR, and HCR are focusing on conception success, essentially, EFC is capturing the timing of when she's entering the milking herd, right? Her age at first calving. So it's really more of a measure of early life reproductive efficiency and heifer development. Biologically and genetically speaking, it behaves quite differently from these other traits, which is why in the previous official evaluation, since it's been introduced in 2019, it was always treated as an uncorrelated trait. Now, it's treated as an uncorrelated trait within the trait group of those existing traits, but long story short, because of that, it is going to be moving into a single trait model because it also simplifies the computation without sacrificing the accuracy. And also, from a producer standpoint, nothing is changing in how it's interpreted. Positive values for EFC still mean earlier calving, which is generally desirable for reducing non-productive time and improving lifetime efficiency.
We like a simple change for an interpretation, so that's perfect. The next one on my list, Taylor, is that we will be waiting to include daughter reproduction data until an animal is 36 months old. Why is this needed? Maybe what was being done before, or really, what is this doing to the trait?
The one issue we identified is that the daughter data tends to enter the evaluation in a biased way. Early on, the daughters that have reproductive records that enter the evaluation sooner are often higher performing animals because these are the ones that get bred and conceive earlier as heifers and therefore will likely get bred and conceive earlier as cows. So that means that our young bulls can initially look better than they really are because their first crop of daughters aren't representative of their full population of daughters. So by waiting until their daughters with records are at least 36 months old before including her data into the evaluation, we're really allowing for a more complete set of records to accumulate. This includes both the high and the moderate to lower reproductive animals. So for these bulls to have a better representation of all their daughters entering the evaluation at a closer time. And that's going to give us a more balanced and stable estimate of the bull's true genetic merit. So this criteria is applied to our cow performance traits. That's DPR, FSC, and CCR. This does not impact HCR.
So, what can we expect to see then as that change goes into effect? What does it mean in the short term, maybe in that delay? Can we call it a delay, Taylor?
You can call it a delay, but essentially that's only going to be evident during this transition period. So we'll see a noticeable transition when we move from the old legacy system to this new revised updated system. Now, what we're going to see in changes, it's not just due to the delay of data entering the evaluation, but it's due to the entire update of reproductive performance evaluations, right? Those 10 changes that you already mentioned. So that initial change, what we might call more of a level shift, will likely be the most visible difference in PTA values. But after that transition, the revised system is going to show much better consistency over time compared to this legacy system. While the change may look large at first, it's really just setting a more stable baseline going forward.
Sure. So we're going to shock the system once, and then it's going to kind of level out and find some solid footing.
Settle into it, yeah.
The last one of the long list of changes we want to just highlight is the mention of re-estimating variance components. Now, for those who do not have a genetics degree, what does that mean? Why is that important for what we're trying to do here?
When we re-estimate variance components, it can be understood as essentially recalibrating the model. They impact things maybe that's more recognizable like heritability or genetic correlations. We call our variance components parameters. So these parameters determine how much the variation that we see is attributed to genetics versus environment. And then also, it tells us how these traits are related to each other genetically. So over time, as our data is growing and the management practices are changing, those relationships can shift. Now, by updating these estimates, we're improving the accuracy of the evaluations and ensuring that the scale of the traits and the relationships between them reflect the current population. This is also why we see some of the changes in the PTA ranges and variation. It's rescaling based on better information, not a change in the underlying biology.
So when people are looking at the document that I've referenced here a few times now, again, in the show notes, for those of you who want to read it, you might notice when you look at those variance components, and Taylor mentioned heritabilities, uh, for the most part, I believe across the board, actually, they've all increased over the previous version. Is there a good explanation as to why they've increased, Taylor?
Best way to describe this is that we're able to capture more of the genetic variation in the model now.
Okay, nice and easy. Let's shift gears here a little bit because we're going to move on from talking about the specific changes into more of the effects that the changes are having. And one of the, we'll say, canaries in the coal mine that kind of sparked the need for this review was looking at the genetic trends for reproductive performance traits and the inverse relationship that they were having with what we expected them to be having. Can you talk to us about what was happening in that legacy system as it relates to genetic trends and what we're able to see in the new system and why that variation is there?
So, one of the biggest takeaways, like you mentioned, was that a lot of what we were seeing didn't really follow a lot of the biological assumptions, and it was more of how we were measuring it. And I think one of the easiest ways to see these is in these genetic trend plots. So, if you look at the two figures, we have DPR on the left and CCR on the right. The blue lines are representing the old legacy system, and the red line is representing the new updated system. So, in that blue line, the legacy system, you see a pretty consistent downward trend over time for both traits. That would suggest that genetically, reproductive performance has been getting worse for years, which doesn't really align with what producers are seeing on farms, especially given how much emphasis has been placed on improving reproduction. Now, when we look at this new revised system, the story changes quite a bit. The red line is showing us how much more of a logical pattern that we're seeing. So the genetic trends are improving over time, which is better reflecting the selection pressure that has been applied for these traits. So what this tells us is that the old model was likely picking up management changes, things like shifts in the breeding strategies or voluntary waiting periods, and incorrectly attributing some of those effects to genetics. Now, with the updated system and the updated models, we're doing a better job at separating those pieces. The most important takeaway here is that we didn't suddenly change the biology of these animals. We're changing how accurately we're measuring this genetic progress. Now we see these trends in red lining up much better with what's happening in the real world. And on top of the genetic trend changes that we see, we also see that our young bulls now are behaving more as expected. So from one triennial to the next, we're seeing some of our young bulls go up Some of them go down as more information accumulates. And this is what we would expect instead of more of a consistent decline in our young bulls that we saw from run to run in our old system. So overall, we're seeing that the evaluations in the new revised system are more stable with less fluctuations between triannual evaluations.
Great news. We love to hear that in the improvements. And I can't believe it's taken us this long to get to this topic, Taylor, but we have to talk about this new trait still. We kind of teased it out at the beginning, right? We have this first service to conception. How did we get to the determination that we needed another trait as we think about the portfolio of options that exist today? And how do we define FSC?
I have to give another shout out to Dr. Jason Graham, who also spent a lot of time developing this trait in conjunction with us. So, FSC, our first service to conception, is what we call an interval trait. So, it's measuring the number of days from a cow's first insemination to when she conceives. What makes it different and why we felt it was needed is that it isolates what happens after the breeding begins. If you think about DPR, that's including the entire timeline from calving to conception, which means it's influenced by those management decisions that we discussed, like when a herd chooses to start breeding. CCR is focusing on the success per insemination, but it doesn't quite capture how long it takes to achieve a pregnancy necessarily. So FSC is filling that gap, and it's going to give us a direct measure of how quickly she can conceive once we've started breeding her, independent of the voluntary waiting period. And that does become essentially important in these modern systems where producers are customizing their breeding strategies more than they did in the past.
So that's a great base definition for us, Taylor, and a good way to understand why we think there's still information to be gained through this new trait. But when producers are looking at their genetic evaluations in August when this trait comes out, how do we interpret what we're seeing?
So, as I mentioned, FSC is an interval trait, meaning we are expressing it in days. In my opinion, that makes it a little bit more intuitive to understand than the percentage based or proportion based traits. So, when we look at this, a positive PTA value is still desirable, and a positive PTA is corresponding to fewer days from the first service to conception. So in this example here, on the top, we have 3 Holstein bulls, and on the bottom, we have 3 Jersey bulls. And if we look at the Holstein bull with the PTA of 0 in the center on the top for first service to conception, we're expecting his daughters to average about 55 days, more specifically, that 55.6 days between their first service and conception. Now, if we look at the bull on the left, we see he has a PTA of +5. He would be expected to have his daughters, on average, conceive 5 days sooner after their first breeding than the breed average of the base animals, or the daughters of the bull with the PTA of 0. That's a pretty meaningful difference when you think about the reproductive efficiency, labor, and overall herd management. Now, on the bottom, I mentioned we also can take a look at Jerseys. They have a similar pattern, but again, we're working with different baselines. It's on a breed base. So our Jersey bull with a PTA of 0 for FSC, we're going to expect his daughters to, on average, have about 52 days between their first service and conception. So Jerseys in this breed base are conceiving a little bit sooner overall, but the PTA is still telling you how a bull compares within that breed. The key idea is that PTA isn't the total number of days, it's a deviation from the breed average. And that makes it easy to compare bulls within a breed and understand how much faster or slower their daughters are expected to conceive. It's also worth noting that because it's an interval trait, it does behave a little bit different than our CCR or DPR, those proportion traits, because it's capturing time rather than a probability.
And if people have interest in other breeds rather than Holstein and Jersey, which we picked the 2 breeds with the highest population, the FSC PTA's breed averages are included in the new trait materials. We'll link those in the show notes as well, so people can check those out. And Taylor, you kind of started to talk about this a little bit, but we do want to just make sure that we've really given the chance to understand the difference in first service to conception and how it fits into this bigger reproductive performance trait portfolio. And how do we know when to apply it versus using cow conception rate or daughter pregnancy rate to make those mating decisions in our herd?
That's a really important question, Katie. We also know that FSC is highly correlated with those traits you mentioned, DPR and CCR, but the correlation doesn't mean redundancy. It just means that the traits share some underlying biology. So each of these traits is still capturing a different part of the reproductive process, right? We said DPR is capturing the full calving to pregnancy interval, including those management decisions. CCR is capturing the success at each insemination, and FSC is isolating that time from first breeding to conception.
So if we start to apply this, Taylor, then in understanding those PTA differences and reading it, we're going to focus in on DPR and FSC for this example. And we know you've covered already, right? FSC is in days and DPR is in percentages, but we're still measuring PTAs off of zero. So how can people start to understand what they're reading and what it indicates when you look at those PTA values that might look similar in the scale that they're printed in?
All of our PTAs deviate from zero, but what we can see here is we can convert them back to what we expect that average phenotype to be when we look at a PTA of zero. And here's that example for both DPR on the top and FSC on the bottom by breed. So PTAs are always expressed relative to the breed mean, and that mean is different depending on each trait. So it's the mean, again, more specifically of the first lactation or heifer animals with phenotypes born in our base year. So right now, the base year is 2020. For example, you mentioned DPR is expressed as a percentage, while FSC is expressed in days. So a Holstein PTA of 0 for DPR would correspond to an average expected daughter pregnancy rate of 32%, while FSC PTA of 0 is going to correspond to about 55 days from first service to conception. So even though these two traits are really highly correlated, they are describing performance in pretty different ways. One is a probability and one is a timeline. And that difference in expression really matters when we're thinking about how to use them. In the modern systems where management's varying more from herd to herd or even on an individual cow-to-cow basis, that additional perspective is becoming really valuable.
Absolutely. And as we think about applying this in our herds, we have now 5 reproductive performance traits. 4 of them are currently in net merit and cheese merit and fluid merit and grazing merit, right? All of our lifetime merit indexes. Does FSC show up in that index or in those indexes already in August?
FSC is not going to be added to any indices in the coming evaluation, August 2026. There will be no changes or updates to net merit in terms of relative emphasis in August.
Let's think about net merit impacts for all of these changes.
Yes.
Just said we're not changing the formula or the weight, but are we going to see changes in net merit values related to all of these revisions to our fertility or reproductive portfolio?
So we do expect some impact on the indices, or let's talk about net merit specifically and the other selection indices, but it's important to understand what's actually changing. Just to highlight what we've already said, the weights or the relative emphasis on each trait, each of those reproductive traits that's already in net merit is not going to change. Those are based on those economic values, and those have not been updated as part of this project. What is changing is the PTA values for these reproductive traits themselves, because we've improved how they're calculated. So when those inputs change, we will see an impact on the index values. They're going to shift as a result. So producers may see some re-ranking of animals, particularly for the traits like DPR and CCR, and potentially through correlated effects into other traits like productive life. But that doesn't mean that the economic importance of reproduction has changed. It means We're measuring the genetic merit more accurately. Just to emphasize, the index isn't being redefined, the inputs are being improved. And over time, as FSC is evaluated for potential inclusion into the indices, that could add another layer, but for now, it's not a part of net merit or the other indexes.
Which is standard operating procedure for new traits
Correct.
when they are introduced, right? We like to get them into the system first, see how they perform, and then we work on getting them included in a net merit or a cheese merit in the future. So, Taylor, let's talk about some of those impacts. You mentioned productive life already as a correlated trait, but let's think about our actual reproductive traits here. Oh, how do we interpret a graph like this, or what does this tell us about the legacy system versus the revised system and the PTAs for these traits?
So we can take away a lot from these scatter plots. We have DPR on the left and CC on the right. What we've included in the different colors are 3 groups of bulls. So the blue, the largest number of dots you see here, is for all males born after 2006 that have high reliabilities over 95%. We also have a group in red of our G bulls, our genomic bulls. And we also have a third group that is that dark blue, and that's going to be our active bulls. And we see on the x-axis is our legacy or our old PTAs for those traits. And on the y-axis, we're seeing the new revised PTAs. And you can track where or how each of these individual animals is changing by looking at a specific dot, right? Where they fall on the line. And what you'll notice is that we do expect to see some changes in that initial transition from the old to the revised system. So when these August evaluations are released, we'll see some changes. And the biggest change is going to happen this initial shift, right? So you'll see the most re-ranking and difference in values happening from that initial transition.
If there wasn't change happening, what would we see? Like, how do we know change is happening by looking at a scatter plot like this?
Yeah, if we saw 0 differences, we would actually hardly see it. It would be one solid line along that diagonal there. So the diagonal from the top right to the bottom left, all the dots would fall along that line, and that would say, hey, these values haven't changed at all. So when we see the dots move away from that central line, it's saying, oh, these animals are changing their values during this initial update. And the good thing is, though, what we can take away is, yes, they don't all fall perfectly on the line, but they're still following a linear pattern. So that tells us that we're not completely changing the ranking of every animal, but some re-ranking will occur because they're not perfectly on that line. Some bulls are going to move up, some bulls are going to move down, and in some cases, you'll see a bit of a shift in scale, especially on those higher and lower ends. But it reflects what we would expect when we're improving the model as we did. It's important to note we're not adding noise. We're really correcting the potential data-driven bias or that management that wasn't accounted for before. Rather, we're recalibrating the PTAs that are estimated. So that's why we see that initial shift when moving from legacy to the revised system.
And these scatter plots are just for Holstein. So let's think about Jerseys for a minute. Tell us what we're seeing here. Is it the same story as Holstein?
It is the same story. It looks a little different because we have a lower number of bulls in each of those groups, right? The more concentrated means that there's a larger number of animals in the plot here. But we still see that nice linear trend. They are slightly shifted, but again, this is just all on a breed base. So we will see some changes, some re-ranking will occur, but this is not a complete overhaul.
And we'll have these types of plots for all of our breeds, for all of the changed traits, so all 4 of them in the coming weeks, so that those resources will be available for folks to figure out what they can expect in their bull populations. And we're also going to have some cow population graphs too, correct, Taylor?
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yeah, we can take a look at the cows as well.
Yeah, so we will make sure we've got enough information out there for you all as we prepare for this really monumental update to the system. This is a huge accomplishment for the team. Taylor, is there anything else that people should know at this point in time about these revisions or about this new trait to help them prepare for August?
Something that could help is understanding maybe when a producer would want to use DPR, CCR versus FSC. And it really comes down to how their reproduction is managed on their farm. For example, if a producer is using fairly consistent voluntary waiting period on their herd level, they still want a big picture measure of reproductive efficiency, DPR is still a very useful trait. But if the focus is on improving conception success per individual service, like they really just want to reduce the number of breedings required, then CCR may be a better tool. FSC is especially useful in systems where breeding decisions are more individualized. For example, if we have some cows bred at different times or under different strategies, FSC gives a clean measure of how quickly that cow can conceive once her breeding starts without being influenced by those prior management decisions. So, in many cases, it's not just about choosing one trait. You can use them together to get a more complete picture, but each trait answers a slightly different question. Together, they give producers more flexibility to match their genetics to their management systems.
Sounds like there's a lot for folks to learn and to read about and to, again, strategize and how this all fits. And now that we've got, again, another tool in the toolbox, right, for good
Yeah.
management decisions or good breeding decisions. So, Taylor, where can people keep learning more? Where are some of these resources at? How can they prepare for August?
Well, this CowCast was a great place to start.
Absolutely.
But we've also developed a range of resources to help the industry understand these updates. That includes detailed trait sheets that you've mentioned. They're going to describe each of these traits, how they're calculated, as well as a broader summary document that's going to walk through the full set of those 10 revisions and the motivation behind each one of them. There's also more comprehensive technical documentation that we're using to write manuscripts to scientific research papers to submit to the journals. And we'll continue to share these updates through CDCB communications, any presentations and publications as we move closer to the implementation and following implementation. So, whether you're somebody that wants to have a higher level overview or maybe more of a technical deep dive, there are going to be resources available to meet you wherever you are. And from my perspective, this has been a really collaborative effort across a lot of people. So we are very excited to be able to share it and help producers make the most of these available tools.
Yeah, and we should probably thank some of those folks that have been involved in this. And I know you mentioned the team at Agile already, but this really does include some pretty key updates that came from the team at USDA Agile alongside the folks at CDCB, but also from a lot of input and discussion back and forth with CDCB committees and industry committees. So it feels great to get this out to folks. And Taylor, you mentioned a lot of great resources available. If people have questions, talk to your genetics expert, those organizations that you work with. If they don't have an answer, they know how to get a hold of us, or you do as well as a listener of this CowCast. So we are here to help everyone prepare for August and these really exciting changes to female reproductive performance traits. So I think that is how we are going to wrap up today, Taylor. This has been a very informative episode of the CDCB CowCast. So thank you for being an incredible guest. And we look forward to having you on the show again to talk about more exciting research in the future.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. It's been a blast, and I'm very excited to have this research implemented in August.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the CDCB CowCast. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you are streaming. Questions or comments about the topic covered in this episode can be sent to outreach@uscdcb.com. That's outreach@uscdcb.com. Or you can send us a message at the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to hearing from you and see you again next month.